Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to ramble on for a bit about the Tinkerer and kind of what its implications will be, as we'll speculate already on what the outcomes will be for certain builds. In this video especially, we'll be looking at strikers and ongoing directives in several ways and with different weapon talents, and also laying out, as we kind of did with the visualizing stats video, as in that video, well worth the watch if you haven't yet, we kind of lay out a mechanic of just tallying off everything that's going to be the same between certain builds, between two different builds that we're comparing, and just keeping the differences. And especially here, when we do that, we're trading off basically, if it's a build with a coyote, we're trading off the coyote's talent versus a weapon talent. Now, there's of course plenty of weapon talents that are worth doing that for, and we'll lay some of those out here. And we'll also jump into some numbers, as I've prepared a spreadsheet for later on where we go over especially what it will add to strikers and ongoing directives, as we said already. So everything will be timestamped down below so you can jump around, but let's go get started. Let's first discuss what the Tinkerer is and what it can do and where we can get it from. As the Tinkerer is an exotic mask, we'll be getting it from the Climax mission. It'll be the reward from that one. If we complete it on Master, on the very first clear of Master, it is guaranteed. But then on any difficulty, it is a chance-based drop from the bosses. So there is definitely ways of getting it. And yeah, completing the Master usually isn't too hard. We haven't seen the mission, of course, yet, but it is usually well doable with a competent team, especially. So once we get it, once it releases, because we basically have to wait for the scouts to complete, and that'll give us access to the Climax mission, and then we have to clear it first on Heroic. We might get it to drop on Heroic already, but of course on Master on the first completion, we'll guarantee get it. That is also per character, so if you have multiple characters, you can actually get multiple ones pretty easily. And then what the Tinkerer mask does is that it's an exotic mask, and what it as its talent has is that the talent of the secondary weapon will be provided to the primary weapon. This is kind of similar to Alpha Bridge, for those familiar with Division 1, as there you would trade talents between the weapons, the final talent in Division 1. Here in Division 2, we of course have one talent per weapon. It is important to understand that it's only the secondary that is giving its talent to the primary. So it isn't both weapons going both ways, because that actually would be a little bit more useful, but it is if the weapons are of the same type, and they have to be of the same type, so you have to have two ARs. For instance, if we have ARs, let's actually equip one. We'll just equip the first one I encountered there. So this, if this was done with a Tinkerer instead of a Coyote, then this Future Perfect would apply to this FAMAS with measured over here, but not the other way around. And that is actually important because, yeah, otherwise, I think actually it would be more useful if it went both ways, because then we could, for instance, you have two weapons and situationally swap between them. Both weapons would have both talents, but we could have something, for instance, more sustain-based, for instance, or ammo conservation-based, like grabbing, for instance, a fall, and then having a FAMAS. And then especially on Striker, you could kind of stack up with the FAMAS to start off with, and then maybe swap to the fall. But none of that is an option here. It is only the talent of the secondary going to the primary. And another part of the text as well for the Tinkerer is that it excludes, and you cannot use names and exotics. Now in the PTS, we could just use any of the names. It was kind of broken that way. But we still don't really know if things like the Lexington will be excluded. So for the calculations we'll see in a little bit, I've actually excluded the Lexington. So we're putting up, for instance, a FAMAS versus a Lexington as our comparisons. As, yeah, that is kind of still unsure. And especially as well for things like White Death and such, that would matter as well. Excluding named weapons is, of course, yeah, some of the named talents are, of course, way stronger. So it makes sense. And yeah, that is the right call on theirs. If we want to look at it from a visualizing stats perspective, as we kind of discussed, what we get when we put on the Tinkerer is basically the same numbers that we've already seen, at least without that second weapon calculated in, is of the Exodus and such. As especially if we compare a build with Coyote to going to Tinkerer, As the Tinkerer has the same stats, weapon damage, crit chance, crit damage, and a mod slot, so we can put basically the exact same stats as a Coyote. And of course, the rest of the build stays the same. It is even the exact same slot in the mask slot. And that means that we're gaining the same stats, so we can basically tally all that away, as that's the same on both builds. And what we keep is that we have the Coyote talent going up against a secondary weapon talent. And we already know the numbers of that. That's around that 7 to 9% that we lose, depending on if we're in the right or wrong Coyote ranges, basically. For instance, this build is set up to take advantage of the 15 to 25, that plus 10 crit chance, plus 10 crit damage. If we're in the wrong range, so to say, with the plus 25 crit damage, we are pretty low on the crit chance for that, as we're on 51 crit chance for this build. Yeah, we would lose a little bit more damage, and yeah, that would be that 9%. So it's that same 7 to 9% that we kind of already see for, yeah, things like the Exodus Glove, where we of course gain the utility of that talent. Here then we would gain the damage or utility of this secondary weapon. Because of course we could have things like pairing Killer plus Measured, or pairing, for instance, as well, Streamline plus Killer or Measured. But what we also can do is take a utility talent. And that's actually what I'm kind of leaning more towards. Because we already have plenty of damage, especially if your watch is full, and then you also have pretty high expertise on top, maxed out build, everything is optimized. You're going to do enough damage most of the time. And it's going to be nice to, for instance, in my case, I used to run fast hands a lot. I'm kind of looking forward to running, for instance, yeah, Measured plus fast hands or Killer plus fast hands. Getting that quick reload back, and then together with that, having a damage talent on the other end. And that will, I think, actually be the real use case, at least for myself. But of course, we can stack damage talents and actually exceed what the Coyote can do. Because if we just look at, for instance, what generally things like Measured would be, it is usually in the 10 to 15% range. It depends on the build. Especially on a build like this, it's around the 12 to 13% range. As we already discussed, the Coyote is 7 to 9%-ish. If this is more than that, of course, we'll do more damage. It isn't as big of a difference as I've seen some people discuss as being 30% or such. I've tracked some of that back to being some bad statements by some people, especially when Streamline was very OP in the PTS. That isn't the case in the endgame. Especially running Streamline will help, and we'll see in the numbers if you're willing to run Streamline, because then you can pair Streamline plus Killer, which is two of the bigger talents, of course, and that can actually be a pretty big difference towards the Coyote. Especially if you're kind of like me that already runs either Killer or Measured, and then we would just pair Killer plus Measured. You don't gain that much over the Coyote. Still a gain, but we do lose, for instance, yeah, that secondary weapon slot, because what I quite often have here, of course, is an ACS, and usually for me as well, in this will be a lefty, just so I can sledge with this and also, of course, stack much faster with this. It is also a secondary ammo type, so that, you know, when I run out of AR ammo, I still have something to shoot without having to go to the pistol. So we have still something competent there. So there is as well some downsides to it, which, yeah, I feel are kind of left out. Together with that as well, yeah, if you're just wanting to, for instance, run, as I've been running quite often, is AR plus LMG, and having, for instance, an LMG that is set up also usually with different crit chances and crit damages, you basically cannot use this secondary weapon slot. It is a complete waste if you're running the Tinkerer, if you're using any weapon in that secondary weapon slot, even if it is of the same type. Because, yeah, it is also important that, yeah, they need to be of the same type. It needs to be 2 ARs or 2 SMGs or 2 LMGs or 2 shotguns, as that's the only way to get the talent to cross over. And now that we understand that we're basically trading a talent, an exotic talent in this case, for a weapon talent, we can actually very easily calculate out. And of course, we can already do that as well, just even without that understanding, by just putting in the builds into multi-calculators like these. I've prepared one here, and I'll link, of course, to this in the description. And we'll go over several. I've prepared 5 multi-calculators here, as we'll go over especially what it means for Striker, with Streamline being the first talent that we pick, or Killer being the first talent that we pick. We'll go over some of the layouts for OD, as especially OD is one of the obvious big gainers here because OD has a bunch of talents it can go for. We already have Sadist, which was, of course, a really big talent, which is perfect for OD. We can pair that as well with Pressure Point or with Vindictive, and we'll kind of look at both. Then also we'll look at Vindictive and kind of how to set that up. And actually, especially here, I feel there is a good way of setting it up. That works out really well. And then we'll also look actually, again, to strikers, but then with an LMG, as especially, for instance, some of the classes have special talents like Frenzy, which can be, of course, a big gain. Normally, we wouldn't per se run that as the main talent because it would, for instance, take a little bit too long to proc. But if we already have a damage talent and then put this alongside of it, and then basically when the time arrives that there is something that survives our first full unload of a mag from LMG, then we do trigger Frenzy, and now we can, of course, melt everything in our way. So we'll kind of look at what those numbers actually mean. Let's start zooming in and going over these. And let's indeed start by looking at this first multi-calculator in which we have Tinkerer, especially with Streamline as a first talent, and then cohabitating that with one of the other talents here. These multi-calculators, I actually have a video on my channel explaining how they work if you want to use them for yourself, but especially here, input happens down here, output comes out in here, where we especially get a damage from mag, we get a burst DPS and a sustained DPS, and especially percentages to compare those with. Here, we're comparing especially the Tinkerer, and then here we have the Coyote in different ranges. Of note is that this is with FAMAS's and Lexingtons. With the Tinkerer, I'm for now assuming that the wording is as is. Names are completely excluded, including, for instance, something like the Lexington. So we are going with a FAMAS, and then here, especially as with the Coyote, we'll have both a FAMAS and a Lexington. We'll see what the final version becomes. For now, for the speculation, I just went this route. So, of course, the Lexington is a little bit ahead on burst versus a FAMAS and quite a bit ahead on sustain on a FAMAS. And we see that outcome here already because we have basically the same build here with the Coyote double, one with the FAMAS, one with the Lexington. And yeah, we can see that numbers-wise, they are ahead. We are, of course, comparing everything to this top slot. And this top slot is then here, Tinkerer, and then together with a FAMAS, as the main weapon, with Streamline as the main talent and Killer. Although, of course, the position of those two talents doesn't matter. It's not like it's bringing half of the talent or something across. It would just be Streamline on one weapon and Killer on another of the weapons. If we have that, we do gain over the Coyote. So this would be the Coyote, especially this Lexington. And we're comparing them as well. We're basically inverse comparing them here. So this would be the number that we have here divided against the Lexington number that we have down here. And we can see that especially with Streamline plus measured or such, we aren't actually gaining that much over the Coyote in the right range. Now, of course, the Coyote can also go into the wrong range, basically, if we're shooting close or shooting far. And then we lose a little bit more, usually around that 2% more, basically. And then it would be ahead. So especially even solo, if you're going, for instance, Streamline plus measured, and of course measured is basically always active. We are averaging it out here, as the first half is usually a little bit better than the second half, but it averages out around, to this number. So it would be around that same average. And especially going Streamline plus Killer, though, we gain about 10%. Here we are actually setting it at 20% headshot rate and then also 60% DTA. Now the DTA here doesn't matter. Later on it will for some of the LMGs and such, and some of the LMG picks that we have for instance, where we have a contractors in there. But especially this 20% headshot rate does matter here because if we actually pump up that headshot rate to 100%, then it drops down quite a bit because of course the headshot and the crit damage are additive to each other. So we gain less from Killer when we do that, and then it's just 7% ahead here. Now, if we take this back to that 20% for everything here, we can basically, if we are willing to go Streamline plus Killer, then when Killer is active, Streamline, of course, also needing to be active, so your skills aren't on cooldown or in use, then you do gain 10%. And 10%, of course, is quite a bit. This is basically around the same numbers as, for instance, yeah, going from grade 0 to 25 for a build like this. If we then look at this last one, which is stream plus utility, now utility here as well would mean basically the second is not adding to the damage, because we're here looking at the damage. But of course, as we discussed, we could go things, for instance, like, yeah, fast hands, future perfect, and preservation, for instance, to name a few useful talents as a secondary, which wouldn't add to our damage, but would help us out in other ways. But this would also be if the damage talent, the secondary damage talent, is inactive. So with killer inactive, we would be a little bit behind. And then with killer active, we would be quite a bit ahead. Now this is versus the coyote, of course, with just Streamline. And then here we would have to activate killer. But killer's activation rate is pretty high, way higher than the 60%, as we kind of discussed in its video. And yeah, if you want to deep dive into that, I already have a video going over the killer activation rates. We are activating killer pretty consistently, especially, for instance, solo and such. I would definitely lean towards, if you're already, for instance, running a full red and you're doing so with a coyote, swapping that out to, for instance, a tinkerer if you are running Streamline, and then with killer. To me, Streamline is not a talent I use much, mostly because I like using my skills. I feel there's more value to using my skills and a lesser talent than it is to Streamline. Let's move on to a second one here. As in this second one, we're making somewhat different choices. So here we're pairing things to killer. Now, with the first one, we're doing killer plus stream, which is the exact same numbers as stream plus killer, as we saw a second ago. But here then as well, killer plus measured and killer plus utility. Now, especially if we kind of look at now, taking killer as the main talent, which I would be much more in favor of taking there, basically. And here as well, we have killer basically active at all times. We see that return in the numbers. If we're taking killer, for instance, plus measured, that is only over the coyote in the right range. It's only 1% and a little bit gain. Now, I would still pick this, especially as well if we are already having too many coyotes. So, for instance, in that same way that I would stick in a Grupo or a Fenris piece, if we already have too many coyotes alongside of a Cheska piece. Here, the Tinkerer definitely, if you're getting the coyote from somebody else in the team, you would kind of go lean that way. But especially in coordinated groups, this gain wouldn't be enough because, yeah, the basically measured is gaining us just a little bit over 1%, a little bit over, close to 1.5%, basically, over the coyote in the right range. Of course, the coyote again, go into the wrong range where it would gain another 2%. But here, it isn't as big of a hike up. And we are giving up the ability of our secondary to be something different, especially having an ACS there, or even, for instance, having an AR plus an SMG, which I know a lot of people enjoy having. This, to me, isn't that big of a gain. And while still worth considering, and I would definitely add one to the build collection with kind of a tinker on it with just killer plus measured, I think as well, again, here, going for instance, a killer plus utility, because both of these here as well, where on the other one we had on the coyote, the main talent being the same basically here as well. We have now killer, of course, here being the main talent. With the utility, we kind of, lose up, especially against the right range, almost up to that 9% here. Just over 8.6% or just under 8.6%. And I'm well willing to give up 8, even 9% for instance, getting fast hands in there, which would also, for instance, help our sustain side of things a little bit. And there is definitely value from a combat perspective to fast hands. But same as well, if you have, let's say, Future Perfect, and you're gaining, let's say you have Technician already, and then you gain another 3 tiers, and then you deploy some Smart Cover here and there, and have a ton of weapon handling from the precision one, and together with that, of course, the detox that comes in with that, and then you would actually beat, for instance, the measured here, definitely. So there is interesting things like that we could do here, much more so, I feel, than the damage, especially on the killer end. If we are going, again, killer plus streamline, which is exactly kind of the same that we had upstairs, but then we had streamline plus killer, that gains quite a bit. But that is especially that. Here as well, the number is a little bit different because, of course, yeah, we're adding in killer here instead of streamline. On this build specifically, killer, when it's active, is larger than streamline. So actually adding in streamline to killer effectively, comparing it here to a killer weapon instead of a streamline that we had upstairs, yeah, we are gaining actually less here. So is that worth it? Definitely worth considering. But to me, again, I feel, especially on the red side of things, on the striker side of things, that utility is much more appealing to me, even with the loss of damage, but recouping it in other ways. Because the double damage is here, well ahead. For me, the option here of killer plus measured isn't that far ahead. Now, of course, as well, we have to remember that here we are taking a FAMAS, which is losing, of course, a little bit. So we could actually compare it a little bit more to get against this other FAMAS, which is kind of 2% behind. So now we would have 3%. Here as well, we're comparing it basically a FAMAS on the Tinkerer versus a Lexington, because we're making the assumption that the Lexington won't work with it. But we'll have to see on the final version, because yeah, if the Lexington works, now it's 3 and a little bit percent. But we'll see that likely next Tuesday. Let's actually go to a place where it does gain quite a bit, and that is OD. As yeah, let's start looking at OD, which especially due to talents will actually gain quite a bit. And was the obvious thing, I feel, the second that we saw kind of the talents and kind of went like, oh, what would work with this? OD is the obvious answer. Here we have the same kind of layout. We have the Tinkerer upstairs. We have the Coyote downstairs here. And here we also have a contractor's version of the OD. And this is the full red OD. So with the chest, and then the backpack is a high end. In this case, we're going with a Vigilance backpack, but that's the same for all of them. We could, of course, go Wicked. We would just have this multiplier be 18 instead of 25 and would basically just shift all the numbers by the same amount. So that doesn't matter here. We do have a contractors version, especially as well. If you do go contractors with OD, it is actually a little bit ahead of the Coyote version, but I generally still prefer usually the Coyote version, and especially small group play, because I'll be providing the Coyote buff, letting the strikers, for instance, on top of that as well, going to, for instance, group of pieces, but maybe in the future with maybe Tinkerer pieces and such. If we compare, and here as well, we're comparing again between all of these, and then on the top slot we have Tinkerer plus going in instead of the Coyote, and then having Sadist plus Pressure Point. The two obvious ones that I feel are very obvious here are especially Pressure Point alongside of Sadist and Vindictive alongside of Sadist. Sadist is of course too big of a gain to like even consider anything else as kind of the main talent. But yeah, especially Pressure Point, of course, is a full flat 15% for the normal version to any status effect, which of course includes the bleed already. So whenever we're triggering status, we're triggering Pressure Point on top. It is important to note then as well. So for instance, if we're using OD in, let's say, Countdown, for that first hunter that we're fighting, we usually don't have OD up. So here we would even lose a little bit more because we're losing as well the either Coyote buff or the contractors piece basically that we would have. And we're kind of trading that in for that Pressure Point, but the Pressure Point usually doesn't, well, we won't have it active on the first hunter. So once we mark them and kill them and take it to the second hunter, that's when we'll have it active. So that's, for instance, an important thing to note. And of course, then on Vindictive, it is an on-kill talent. When we get a kill, we get 16% crit chance, 16% crit damage. And that is also group-wide within a radius around you. So it isn't group-wide in the same way that the Coyote is, where just any person in the entire raid group gets the bonuses. Here, they do have to be close enough to you. But in a lot of places, that's very worthwhile. And of course, yeah, it buffs you and it buffs others as well. So it is definitely worth considering. And as well, here we have utility with it. And also just, yeah, why don't we just go killer or streamline? Now, with those, of course, we'll look at them in a second, what that means versus just taking, for instance, Pressure Point. But here then we also have, the Coyote, and then actually taking an MG5 and then Carnages. So the weapons wise here as well, the Tinkerer variants are with MG5s, because the Carnage should definitely be excluded. In the PTS, we could use the Carnage. And actually what we could do in the PTS is take a Carnage and a normal Sadist weapon and have perfect Sadist and normal Sadist. They would actually even be additive to each other, which was interesting to see because they're usually, you know, we consider them amps, but so that will mean they're always multiplicative, we kind of say. But actually, yeah, if we kind of cheat it in this way and we have two Sadists in the same pool, they do go into the same pool. They don't multiply against themselves as well. That was interesting to see with the PTS. But that was the PTS. The Carnage should definitely not be usable once we get the final version. But then here, you're, of course, on the Coyote end, we can use a Carnage. Although I'm kind of looking forward to swapping it out to an MG5. The Carnage being a Negev, the Negev handles really horribly. And because of that, we do still kind of lean towards it because as well, on the damage per mag end and such is, of course, 150 round. Although here we're actually using Survivalist for this. So we don't even have the 150 rounds or the 100 rounds for the MG. Luckily for the MG, I would take Gunner at that point with the OD, just fixed with it. Giving up that other bonus, but gaining those 15 rounds. That's going to be worthwhile, I feel, with the MG5. We can, of course, also go, and that we have that here, which is this last one, the Stinker plus Sadist plus Pressure Point. This is actually with the M249 / Mark 46. So we're going to have all the numbers here. Let's actually look at those numbers so that we see when we take, and here on the right side again, we're comparing against this, what we would consider the normal version, the 15 to 25 Carnage here set up as well to take advantage of that Coyote at mid-range. That's kind of the version we have now. Here, these black numbers are comparing against that, basically dividing the other way around. Because what we see especially is, yeah, the pressure point here as our 100% point here is way ahead of, for instance, something like Vindictive. Here, we're actually not setting up the build to, for instance, take advantage of Vindictive fully because we're at 60% crit chance. So for this build, I'm kind of considering it kind of in a solo setting. So we are setting it up at 60 crit chance without a Coyote. So we're just upping our crit chance. We're losing some crit damage to do so in comparison to the Coyote. And if that is our 100% point, especially if we're just gaining the 16% crit damage, but not the 16% crit chance from Vindictive, it doesn't gain us that much. We'll see in a little bit, actually, another multi-calculator where we do it differently and we do leave a gap for the crit chance as well. And that adds quite a bit to it. But especially as well, going, for instance, here, Sadist plus Utility, giving up that Coyote damage. We see actually because of the lower crit chance crit damages of this build, it is a bigger loss than we saw with some of the other versions that we saw upstairs with the ARs, with Striker. Here, we are actually losing quite a bit if we're going with a utility talent alongside of it versus Pressure Point. And that's especially as well, Pressure Point being much bigger than some of the other talents we saw earlier. So we lose much more against it. Here we see as well, we could actually go Killer or Streamline. The reason I would just go Pressure Point is that whenever we have Sadist active, we're going to have Pressure Point active as well. Killer being an on-kill talent, we do gain a little bit more, and especially this build as well doesn't have that high crit damage, so the pool isn't as diluted, so we gain in percentage-wise more from Killer than we would, for instance, on that Striker that has a little bit more. Here, though, what we have is that we need to get a kill going for this, of course. And the consistency difference, I would definitely lean towards Pressure Point at that point. Even with it being close to 5%, well, we could definitely make this choice, and yeah, it's definitely a choice worth considering. I would just go for the consistency at that point. Especially as well, the way that I run OD much more is, well, I sometimes do run it solo, and then it's just there for dealing with, especially the ammo directives, and then we can still take 5 directives. In a group setting, though, where I'm competing for kills, which is much more the place where I use OD, for instance, let's say in Kandan and such, we're just not going to trigger that many kills. Just because we're competing with, for instance, in Kandan with 7 other players, so that eats into that a little bit. And then Streamline just gains us basically a % there, exactly, actually. And that for the loss of our skills, I would just go Pressure Point at that point. Like, I would think that would be much more valuable. Now, Streamline would be active even when Sadist, for instance, isn't, so you could consider it in that way. I would still lean more towards that pressure point and just making sure that we do have statuses going, and then as well having a skill, for instance, to make sure that we have some statuses going, even for instance, if the enemy has diminishing returns on the bleed and they don't bleed anymore. If we are, for instance, gunner, we send out a Banshee Pulse and disorient them and then get this bonus going. I don't feel it's valuable enough to go these routes when, from most perspectives, this will just have perfect uptime, especially on OD. If we look at it inversely and compare it against the Coyote, yeah, we are gaining about 6% here with the pressure point, and that's, of course, a decent pick-me-up there. The Vindictive is a little bit of a loss, actually, versus that Coyote. But, of course, we're providing a group-wide buff. And as we saw as well, we didn't actually set up the build perfectly to take care or to make use of the Vindictive in full. We'll see actually downstairs a little bit of better version of this. I feel especially Pressure Point and Vindictive are kind of, yeah, great go-tos, especially if you're in a team and, for instance, a pretty cohesive team and you're, moving as a group and such. Grabbing Vindictive will help the group quite a bit. So Coyote, especially the Coyote version versus the Tinkerer for OD, I feel OD definitely goes Tinkerer when it comes out. I'm not going to keep any Coyote variants. We'll put the Coyote in the corner because at the end of the day as well, the Tinkerer will still be a little bit harder to get. You do need to complete the Master mission for to get it guaranteed, or you have to grind out the climax mission on other difficulties to get it. So there's still value to the Coyote version. It'll be easier. But yeah, the Tinkerer, I feel, is the way to go. Now let's actually look a little bit more in depth into Vindictive. And let's look actually at that Vindictive a little bit. As here we have the same Tinkerer setup we had a second ago. So OD Tinkerer with a Vigilance backpack, the rest being OD pieces. And then together with Sadist and then Vindictive. But then the Vindictive here at different crit chance values. And with it being on and off, basically. So especially setting up at 60 crit chance. So the best way to kind of get that number is to actually go a little bit over. We go to 60.5. As we do have the crit chance third stat on the LMGs. With all of these, I would just say go crit chance third stat for them. Any build, basically any build that is centered around crit chance, crit damage. On the LMG, you just want to go crit chance. And if we have the Coyote or the Vindictive on or off, basically, here on this, of course, the Vindictive is 16% crit chance, 16% crit damage when it activates. If we don't leave a gap for the crit chance side of things, we're basically just gaining a little under 5%, 4.94% there. Damage output. This again at this 20% headshot rate, which doesn't matter, of course, as the headshot is additive to the crit chance, crit damage multiplier, basically. If we set ourselves up at 50, which we can do by swapping out some of the mods that we have from crit chance to crit damage, what we have then is actually that when it is off, we're basically around the same number, and we would kind of then set it up this way much more. Because our crit chances, we're comparing everything against this top number here. Our crit chance being so much lower, but still gaining a little bit more crit chance, we do lose a little bit of efficiency. We're not balancing our crit correctly for that, but we're of course then leaving a gap for the Vindictive to come in. And now from that, at least from the crit chance side, we're kind of using 9.5 of that 16% crit chance. That gains us, of course, a lot more damage when it is active, and we gain about 11% there. And this, of course, is a much bigger jump up. Now, here then, as well, we can even push it further and go to 44, losing, here we lost weapon mods, here we're losing another stat on the gear or a mod on the gear. We're flipping that from crit chance to crit damage, and we do have the space for that actually as well. We are losing a little bit more. Here 97.5, so we're losing 2.5% when we don't have Vindictive active, which is a decent loss, and you should consider that. But then we have now, from the 16, we're using 15.5% of it. So whenever we do trigger Vindictive, and Vindictive is guaranteed on a status effect kill, we should be status affecting most of the enemies. We do need to get the kill. It isn't just any kill, basically. It doesn't need to be a kill by us with the weapon. And then when we do, we trigger Vindictive. And here we're gaining quite a bit. So here we're gaining 15% at this point. In the black numbers here, we're comparing this actually to the upstairs ones, where we had the pressure point plus sadist. So we're comparing against this top value here is the black ones on the side. So we can see that actually, yeah, as we saw, if we're not setting up the build to take full advantage of Vindictive, we're pretty far behind the pressure point plus sadist combo. But actually, if we look at this very last one, where we have Vindictive active, and we've set up the build to be at 44.5 crit chance, so we are gaining massively from the crit chance and the crit damage from Vindictive, it actually is about the same amount as pressure point. Now, still, pressure point is much more consistent because it just needs a status affected enemy. You're just going to be doing that damage. It doesn't require a kill, especially if you're competing for some of the kills. So there is definitely value to going pressure point, especially for instance, if you're running solo. Although solo as well, you would kill more, so now the Vindictive is actually more easy to trigger. So it kind of depends. But this, of course, still needs an on-kill. So there is definitely a difference between these two. Then as well, here actually on a striker, we have a striker here, not per se to compare against the numbers that we have here, as also we're actually just comparing between these two by themselves. And what we see here is a striker that is just a normal striker, that's the 100% point. And then what we have is a striker and just gaining the 16 crit damage from an allied player, just giving them Vindictive because of the group-wide effect. Even just gaining that crit damage on top, the player there gains a further 4.5%, 4.67%. So even the strikers, even if they're just not even set up to fully, for instance, make use of the Vindictive, they still gain about 5% there. And we, of course, are also gaining decent amounts. This, though, was kind of eye-opening. And I do think I will set up for the use cases that I have to go with this 44.5 with the Tinkerer. Try to trigger Vindictive consistently. Now, what we still will see quite often is there's going to be Coyotes in the team, so they'll fill up already a little bit of this, but this will then be an extra on top of it, especially, for instance, in those moments where the team just kind of bunches up on a boss or something, everybody's kind of in close range, there is no mid-range Coyote being triggered. This Vindictive might still then be active, and this, of course, can also basically do kind of the task of the Coyote and give us that crit chance, especially. And then the crit damage is always on top of whatever we have. So I do feel there is a lot of value to going with OD, setting it up this way, and then taking Vindictive as our second. As lastly, we'll look here at Frenzy, which of course for some of the weapon classes we have talents tied to them. So for shotguns especially, we'll have Brazen plus Pummel. And in the end-up look version, we'll kind of look at that. Especially that one is a little bit more interesting where, for instance, if we want to stick a Hunter or a Tinkerer into a Hunter's Fury build, we would need to either take the chest and the backpack. Is that worth it? We'll go in the in-depth look with that one. Here we're looking at Frenzy on just Striker, and we're just taking the same Striker we had before, sticking an LMG on it, in this case a Mark 46 or a M249. They're basically base stats the same. The Mark 46 is a little bit preferred. And then taking, for instance, yeah, Frenzy plus Killer here especially. Now, again, Tinkerer on top, Coyote at the bottom here. And especially on the Coyote, of course, we can kind of, yeah, we're comparing as well, having Killer and Frenzy separately and not having either of the talents activated and how much percentages they are. Here at the top, we're comparing, of course, against this Frenzy plus Killer. So both of them being up and active. I think it's also important then to kind of compare here, as in the black here, we're just comparing against this Tinkerer without either of the talents being up. So of course that would lose against the Coyote, because with the Coyote, we would have the damage bonus up of the Coyote, basically. And then even if either Killer or Frenzy isn't up, it would still win out. And we see that result as well. So the 10.5 that we have there is less than this 11.4. But once we have either of them activated, of course, we gain enough to kind of catch up a little bit. We're still behind, but then especially once both activate, then we reach somewhat silly numbers because, again, if this is the 100% point, we're taking that Tinkerer without either of the talent activated. Once we activate both talents, we're basically doubling our damage versus that. And of course, this number, this Tinkerer, would be just around 9% behind the Coyote version. So it is going to surpass it heavily. Now, of course, if we kind of compare our frenzy number from up here to our frenzy number from down here, just by that talent itself, if it's just one of the talents active and we're just comparing that way, of course, they're going to lose to the Coyote. The Coyote's talent damage or the damage buff is there, of course, as well. But especially, I think this situationally might be a really good pick, because we'll have Killer going quite consistently, just getting some kills in. And then basically, if we run into the situations that we do reach the end of a mag and we have to reload, now we're outputting so much more damage that we're just going to melt whatever's kind of in front of us. Now, this does come at the cost, of course, as for instance, having a utility talent as a secondary. Same for LMGs, going, for instance, Killer plus Fast Hands, of course, sounds like a pretty good option. And what we would have as our damage number then would just be this Killer, because just the Killer would be active, nothing alongside of it. So if we kind of compare that 12.7 versus just here this Killer active, this 13.6, we are losing some damage, but then again, we would do so for a utility talent. And especially as well, we can kind of look at Frenzy plus Streamline as well. So one of the things to consider here especially is, because of the damage or the calculation pools that some of the things are going into, Frenzy, of course, is feeding into RPM and weapon damage. If we are feeding into that and we're also feeding with Streamline into that, then we're going to land actually pretty lot lower than we would with, for instance, having Frenzy plus Killer, of course. Now, that is important to kind of consider, because as well, we don't want, for instance, Killer plus Strained. We don't want Streamline plus Optimist. They are big enough that they will impact each other. So instead, even if you wanted to go that way, I wouldn't actually recommend going, for instance, Strained or Optimist nowadays. Measured by itself is kind of more than both of those, and pretty consistently. But just as a case study, basically, we would want to go, if we're going weapon damage on the one talent, going crit damage on the other makes more sense than adding even more weapon damage. Now, of course, some things are so big that they will, that it doesn't matter per se. If you already have Streamline and you add Frenzy on top of that, the Frenzy is, of course, going to be humongous by itself just because it's a very big talent. But we do want to, as always, kind of diversify our multipliers. So if we can feed it into a different pool, likely you will have better outcomes than just feeding everything into one pool. So here we see that as well. The Frenzy plus Streamline is actually, the Streamline versus Killer is actually a much bigger gap than it would normally be, because that Streamline is feeding into weapon damage, Frenzy is feeding into weapon damage. Because of that, the diminishing returns is worse for it, and we see that result there. So that's just something to consider. If you're going to go with talents, generally as well, it's going to be better, If we have weapon damage here, go crit damage on the other one. That's also why Streamline plus Killer works out so well for this. And I feel as well, for LMGs, going, for instance, Frenzy as a secondary, and it just comes in when the going gets tough, the Frenzy will get triggered, basically. Because that will happen then on basically boss fights and such, or, the bigger boss waves where we have multiple waves in a row and you have a bunch of stuff to shoot at. Then suddenly the Frenzy will come in. And then in the quick parts where it's just a wave, a patrol, that they're just going to melt to the Killer by itself. And that's going to be interesting as well, of course, with Tinker, is kind of the talent combinations that we can kind of go for, and especially some of these that are tied to classes like Frenzy, like Brazen. They sound pretty yummy. And that brings us to the end of this rambling talk into the Tinkerer, as it is definitely an interesting subject. I'm very much looking forward to next Tuesday to getting my own and doing the master mission and getting some. And then especially, the big question is, will names work with it? And then we're especially talking not perfect, talented names like the White Death, like the Lexington, as of course they will make a difference if we can have those. But the Tinkerer by itself is already a very interesting piece. I feel everybody is kind of excited to get one. I do want to say, though, that, yeah, some of the numbers going around of it being like 40% more or 30% more is... I'm not seeing that. That is not on my radar. You can definitely exceed the Coyote. And yeah, that will by itself make it a meta choice. It will go into the general metas and we'll use it here and there. I don't think the Coyote is definitely gonna go away. Firstly, it is easier to get, even for future players and such, much more so than a master mission will be to complete. And also, alongside of that, in a group setting, in a coordinated team, you would still want at least 1 or 2 Coyotes, just for their group-wide bonuses. But I feel especially, yeah, OD is to me one of the places where it's very obvious that it would benefit a lot from it, and I definitely will change those to be with that. I do feel as well, actually, we didn't discuss that per se here, but a lot of the somewhat reddish hybrids, so if we're kind of thinking, let's say, a red FI, that could work really well with having Future Perfect alongside of a damage talent. For some of the things, though, I definitely want to caution that anything that kind of is already really tied to, for instance, a certain weapon exotic. So I've seen a lot of discussion around, for instance, third drone hybrids and such. I feel the capacitor there is such a big gain that where we're using exotics weapons, we're going to keep using those exotic weapons most likely. Same, of course, as well, if you're already into using, let's say, Chameleon or Pestilence or Bighorn or anything of that sort, that's not going to work with the Tinkerer. So all of those builds are kind of going to stay the same. And the other big one that I don't feel the Tinkerer competes with at all is the Memento, because the Memento, the builds where we use Memento, usually that's feeding into several things that the long bonuses will give into. For instance, on the tech tanks, it's giving to the shield, it's giving to our armor, it's giving to our weapons. The Tinkerer can't actually compete with that. Same, for instance, as well with some of the third drone hybrids, where it's feeding again into the weapons and then especially into the skills pretty heavily. There, the Tinkerer won't kind of do the same. But there is definitely a lot of places, and one of the things I'm likely going to do is, especially over this coming weekend in live streams, kind of go through the build collection and just literally go build by build and go like, will the Tinkerer fit in this and what could it do? And just speculate for myself even more. And then we'll come back likely the Saturday after the release of the Tinkerer. We'll come back with an in-depth look into it and kind of go over it much more in depth. So yeah, I hope you join me for that one. If you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as it does help out. Hope to catch you in the future, and as always, have a good night.